There is a phenomenon, well documented and frequently fatal, in which a person lost in wilderness will walk in circles without realizing it. The dominant foot, typically the right, has a slightly longer stride. And over the course of hours, this asymmetry bends a straight line into a curve and eventually a loop. Search and rescue teams are trained to look for it. They find the same boot print again and again in the snow or the mud, a record of someone who believed they were moving forward. But what happened to me was not that. What I experienced on the Kettlebrook Trail in the Ozark National Forest during the first week of September was something different. Something that I have spent 7 months trying to articulate, failing, trying again. The trail I was on did not bend me back through my own footprints. It led me somewhere I had never been. Somewhere that by any rational accounting should not have existed at the coordinates where I found it, and yet it did. And what happened there, what I found, what found me, is the story I have been asked to tell. My name is Elliot Marsh. I am 29 years old. I am a cartographer, a map maker by training and by temperament. I have been navigating wilderness since I was 12 years old, and I trust maps the way other people trust gravity. As foundational, as non-negotiable, the trail showed me something maps cannot hold. It showed me what the land remembers when no one is watching. This is what happened. Let me tell you about myself, because the story requires it. Understanding what happened to me requires understanding who I am or who I was. Before September, I grew up in Fayetteville, Arkansas, at the edge of the Ozarks. In a household that treated the outdoors as a classroom and a refuge, my mother was a geologist. My father was a park ranger who later became a surveyor. On weekends, we drove into the forest and my parents named things: rock formations, soil compositions, plant communities, watershed gradients, with the specific reverence of people who believe naming is a form of love. I absorbed their methodology. I became someone who felt most comfortable. When the territory matched the map, I studied cartography and geographic information systems at the University of Arkansas, and went to work for a private geographic survey company after graduation. My job was field verification, taking existing digital maps and walking the terrain to correct errors, update changed features, document anomalies. I spent about a third of each year in the field, alone or in small teams, moving through landscapes with the professional attention of someone whose job is to notice when the world does not match its recorded description. I was good at it. I was very good at it. And I was, by the time of September, quietly, specifically burned out in the way that precision-oriented people burn out. Not dramatically, but completely. The weariness going all the way to the bone. The pleasure I'd once taken in exactness replaced by a mechanical competence that felt like its hollow twin. The September trip was supposed to be personal. My own time, no company work order, no deliverable. I'd chosen the Kettlebrook Trail in the Ozark National Forest specifically because I knew it well. I'd mapped sections of it during a field verification 2 years prior, and I trusted the territory. I wanted somewhere familiar that could ask nothing of me beyond walking. I went alone, because I always went alone when I needed to be in my own head. I told my roommate, a grounded and sensible person named Theo, where I was going. I sent him the trailhead coordinates and a planned route. I had a detailed paper map, USGS 7.5-minute topographic. The gold standard, a GPS unit I trusted as a secondary tool, a full kit of gear, and 3 days of food for what was planned as a 2-day trip, because I always built in margin. I signed the trailhead register at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in the first week of September and started walking. The trail was exactly as I remembered it. The first mile was open, second growth, hardwood, hickory, and black oak. The ground covered dense with late summer vegetation. The trail was well maintained, the blazes clear, the grade gentle. By mid-morning, I'd reached the first of 2 creek crossings, a wide shallow ford that I knew from my previous survey, and waded across in my boots without bothering with the stepping stones. Everything matched the map. Every contour line, every drainage, every bearing. This was, I realize now, the last period during which everything matched, The divergence began in the afternoon. The Kettlebrook Trail at its midsection runs along the eastern flank of a ridge, a long, gradual slope that faces northeast and stays shaded for most of the day, which creates a microclimate, cool and damp enough to support plant communities you don't typically find at this elevation in Arkansas. Mosses, ferns, the occasional trillium. I'd noted and photographed all of these 2 years prior. They were in my field notes, at roughly the 5-mile mark, according to my GPS. The trail should have curved left-northwest, around a rocky outcrop that my previous survey had documented as approximately 20 meters across, with a distinctive double-peaked profile visible from the trail, a recognizable landmark, one I was actively watching for. The curve came, but the outcrop was wrong. Not absent, wrong. Where the map showed a 20-meter double-peaked formation, what I found was a single continuous rock face, perhaps 40 meters wide, surface draped in a variety of moss I didn't recognize from this area. The profile was entirely different. The double peak was gone. I stopped on the trail and looked at the rock. Faced for a long moment, I checked the GPS. I was at the correct coordinates. The elevation matched. The bearing matched. The landmark did not. My first thought, geological shift. Not impossible. The Ozarks are an ancient, eroded landscape, and collapse features in limestone and sandstone are well documented. A section of the double peak could have fallen in the 2 years since my survey, but the scale of what I was seeing, the change wasn't a collapsed section. The entire formation was different. Its mass, its character, its orientation. You do not reshape 40 meters of bedrock in 2 years. I wrote a note in my field book, dated and timed it. Photographed the formation from multiple angles. Noted the GPS coordinates and the discrepancy with my existing data. Stayed in my professional mind, kept it analytical, kept it measurable. A discrepancy is not a mystery. A discrepancy is data. I kept walking. The next divergence came 40 minutes later. A drainage crossing, a seasonal stream, dry in September, that the map showed running northwest to southeast across the trail, with a distinct flat-bottomed ravine, maybe 6 feet deep. I knew this crossing. I'd noted the exposed shale and its banks. The way the root systems of the adjacent trees stretched down into the cut in a pattern. I'd sketched for the survey report. The crossing was there. The ravine was there. The dimensions were correct. But the shale was not exposed. The banks were covered in the same unfamiliar moss I'd seen on the outcrop, thick and dark. Impossibly dense for a drainage that ran dry by late summer. And the roots I'd sketched were gone. Not dead and rotted. Gone. As if the trees had never extended into the cut at all. I stood at the edge of the ravine and felt something shift in my stomach. Not the professional assessment of discrepancy feeling. Something older. Something from before I had professional frameworks. Something is wrong here. Not wrong with the data. Wrong with the place. I crossed the ravine and kept walking. I told myself I was tired. I told myself 2 years was enough time for vegetation to change significantly. I told myself that I was in my head, that the burnout was coloring my perception, that I was looking for problems because my mind in its exhausted state had mistaken vigilance for purpose. I was wrong about all of that. But telling myself those things kept me moving, which was, in retrospect, exactly what I should not have kept doing. I had planned to camp at a site I'd used during the previous survey, a flat shelf above the creek at mile 7. With a fire ring left by earlier visitors and good drainage and a sight line to the south that gave beautiful evening light, I knew the site. I was looking forward to it the way you look forward to something comfortable and familiar. When the day has been strange, I reached mile 7 by my GPS at 4:30 in the afternoon. The shelf was there. The drainage was correct. The sight line to the south existed. The fire ring was not. Instead of a fire ring, instead of the ring of pale stones I'd arranged myself and photographed for the survey, there was a depression in the earth. Not a natural depression. Something deliberate. A circular indentation in the soil, perhaps 2 feet in diameter and 4 inches deep, its edges cleanly defined, as though something cylindrical had pressed into the ground there with significant weight oversignificant. Time. The soil inside the depression was a different color than the surrounding ground, darker, almost black. Where the earth around it was the typical russet brown of Ozark forest floor, and it was cold when I crouched and pressed my palm to it. The coldness came through immediately. Not the neutral cool of shaded ground, but something more intense. Active. Almost. As though whatever had made the impression had left its temperature behind. I stood up and looked around the campsite. The familiar flat shelf. The familiar trees. The familiar drainage pattern. And then, at the edge of the clearing, something I had no explanation for. A trail marker. Not a blaze on a tree, a physical marker. A carved wooden post set into the ground at the clearing's northeast edge. The style was old, the kind of trail marking I associated with pre-World War II Forest Service work. The lettering cut by hand rather than stamped. It was weathered to the gray of old driftwood. The surface colonized by lichen. I walked to it and crouched down to read it. The letters were worn but legible. They read, Kettlebrook 1 point for me, an arrow pointing down. Toward the ground, not toward a direction. Not northwest or south or east. Straight down. I stared at that arrow for a long time in the September afternoon light. The forest was warm and bug-voiced and entirely normal around me. The light coming through the canopy and the gold dust columns of late afternoon. Everything calm. Everything ordinary, except the arrow pointing into the ground, and the cold depression where my fire ring used to be, and the rock formation that shouldn't exist, and the moss that shouldn't be there. I made camp. I built a fire well away from the depression, and I ate my dinner. And I wrote 4 pages of field notes. And I checked the GPS 6 times, and it kept telling me I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The GPS was right. That was, I'd come to understand, precisely the problem. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The coordinates were correct. But the territory at those coordinates was not the territory that had been there 2 years before. The land had changed. Or, and this was the thought I could not fully shut out as I sat by my fire while the forest dark deepened around me, the land had always been this way. And the map had always been wrong, and something had brought me to the version that the map couldn't hold. I slept badly. I woke at 2 in the morning with the unambiguous certainty that something was standing at the edge of the camp. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened. Silence. Then the sound of the forest settling. The creak of branches. The small movements of night creatures, and under all of it, so faint I had to strain to hear it. A sound like paper. Like something being folded and unfolded, rhythmic and patient, and precisely at the edge of audibility. I did not get up to check. I waited until dawn. Dawn came gray and damp. A mist off the drainage below the camp, thickening into a low fog that reduced visibility to 30 feet in every direction. I made coffee and broke camp efficiently, moving with the purposeful economy of someone who has decided that motion is better than stillness. My plan was straightforward. Continue to the trail's end point at mile 10, where the forest road met the trailhead for the western access, and loop back via the forest road to my car at the eastern trailhead, a route I'd walked variants of dozens of times. Nothing complex. I set off at 7:15. The fog held at mile 8. The trail changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way I could have caught immediately. It narrowed slightly from the well-maintained 2-foot clearing I'd been walking to a path perhaps 18 inches wide. The vegetation pressing in more closely on both sides. The blaze marks on the trees became less frequent than absent. The ground underfoot changed from the compacted, root-networked hardpan of a maintained trail to something softer, slightly spongy. The footfall different in a way I registered through my boots before my conscious mind noted it. I stopped and checked the GPS. I was on the trail. Coordinates confirmed. Bearing correct. Elevation consistent with the mapped trail profile. The trail, however, did not look like any maintained path I'd walked. It looked old. Not neglected, old. The way a path looks when it has been walked for so long and by so many that it has become part of the landscape, rather than an imposition on it. The edges worn smooth by time beyond reckoning. The soil compressed to the density of stone, and it was going somewhere. My map said nothing went. The Kettlebrook Trail at mile 8 runs roughly northeast toward the western access road. The path I was now on was curving, gently, almost imperceptibly, but consistently, northwest and then west. Away from the access road and deeper into the forest interior, I watched my compass and my GPS simultaneously and felt the divergence accumulating with each step. My professional mind said, "Stop, backtrack. This is the phenomenon you were trained to recognize. The territory failing to match the record, and the trained response is to not compound the error." But I didn't stop, and I have thought a great deal about why. I think it was the path itself. The quality of it, the age, and the intention of it. Sense that this was not a random deviation, but a deliberate route going somewhere with purpose. In 7 years of field verification, I had never encountered a trail that wasn't on my maps. The Ozark National Forest has been thoroughly surveyed. Its trail system is documented. There are no unknown paths, and yet here was one. Old and certain, and leading somewhere the maps denied. I followed it. The fog thickened as the trail descended gradually. Consistently, following what felt like a drainage toward a low point in the terrain. The trees changed. The second-growth hardwood of the upper trail gave way first to older timber. The trunks wider and more widely spaced, and then to a forest type one could not immediately identify. The bark patterns were wrong for the species I knew. The canopy was dense enough to reduce the gray fog light to something greener, more filtered. The quality of light in an aquarium I was cataloging as I walked, that professional habit, the naming reflex, and finding myself unable to name things with certainty. The bark resembled white oak, but wasn't. The understory shrubs resembled spicebush, but weren't. The moss on the rocks was the same species I'd been seeing since yesterday. Dense, dark, utterly unfamiliar. 30 minutes into following the unknown path, I came to the place. I heard it before I saw it. A sound like water, but not quite. The sound of water is random, chaotic in the specific way of liquid finding its path. This was rhythmic, ordered the sound of water with intention. I came around a curve in the path, through a stand of the not-quite trees, and stopped. In front of me was a clearing, and in the center of the clearing was something that changed the rest of my life. I will try to describe what I saw accurately and without the distortions that come from telling a story too many times. I have been careful about this. I have the field notes I wrote immediately afterward, before memory had time to smooth and dramatize. And I am working from those. The clearing was approximately 30 meters in diameter. It was roughly circular, the tree line receding in a clean arc that had none of the ragged, opportunistic quality of natural clearing edges. The ground was covered in a low-growing ground cover I had never seen, deep green, almost perfectly uniform, with small white flowers spaced at intervals, so regular they looked arranged. At the center of the clearing stood a structure. I use that word carefully. It was not a building in any architectural sense I could apply. It was more like the idea of a structure made manifest, the essential qualities of shelter and boundary and threshold without, the particular forms that human construction imposes on those qualities: stone, unmortared; wood, uncut. The organic geometry of something grown as much as built, the way a termite mound is built, the way a beaver dam is built. Intelligence in the construction, but not human intelligence. It was perhaps 15 feet at its highest point. Its walls, if walls is the right word, curved rather than angled. There were openings, regular and deliberately placed, that let in the green-filtered light. There was no door. Only a threshold, a change in the ground material that marked the boundary between outside and inside as clearly as any physical barrier, and around the structure, surrounding it in a pattern that radiated outward like a dropped stones, ripples and still water were the marks. Circular. Depressions in the ground. Identical to the one I'd found at my campsite the previous evening. The same diameter, the same depth, the same dark soil. the same quality of cold emanating upward when I crouched to touch one, dozens of them. Each one the same. Each one spaced at exact intervals in the radiating pattern, extending from the structure outward to the clearing's edge. I stood at the path's end and took this in with my professional apparatus, measuring distances with my eyes, noting orientations with my compass, photographing systematically with the small camera I carried for field documentation. I was maintaining the mode, the analytical mode that keeps fear at arm's length by making it data. But the fear was there, underneath the professionalism, cold and specific. Not the fear of a threat I could name. The fear I'd described before, the fear of encountering the unmappable, the thing that exists outside the framework. I had made a map of this area. I had walked every inch of the terrain within a mile of these coordinates and recorded it in meticulous detail. This clearing had not been here. This structure had not been here. These marks had not been here, and yet here they were, ancient and certain and arranged with a precision that made my professional soul ache with something between dread and involuntary admiration. Someone or something had been making maps of this territory long before I had. From the inside out, I stepped across the threshold. The interior was a single space. No divisions, no furniture in any human sense. The floor, the same dark compressed earth as the exterior depressions. The ceiling, the convergence of the curved walls at the top, let in shafts of the green filtered light that moved slightly with the fog outside, giving the interior a quality of underwater stillness. It smelled of soil and wet stone and something else. Something organic but not rotting, alive rather. The smell of things growing in the dark. On the walls, embedded into the stone, or perhaps extruded from it, the distinction was unclear. Were markings? I'll be precise. They were not the abstract symbols I might have expected. No spirals or pictographs or the usual vocabulary of ancient human marking. They were contour lines, topographic contour lines. The specific graphic language of cartographic elevation representation, the closed curves that indicate hilltops, the V-shapes that indicate drainages, the spacing that indicates slope gradient. The visual language of maps. My visual language. The system I had been using for 7 years to describe terrain, except these predated my work here. I could tell from the lichen colonization of the stone, from the degree of weathering, from the erosion of the finest lines, decades at minimum. More likely, longer. The map language on these walls was old. It had been placed here, or grown here, before I had ever walked this trail. I stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, reading the walls the way I would read a map, and as I turned, the contour lines resolved into a coherent image, a topographic representation of the surrounding terrain. Wrapped around the interior of the structure in a continuous panorama, a map of the forest I was standing in. An accurate map. More accurate, in fact, than the USGS 7.5-minute topographic I carried. Features I'd been noting as discrepancies since yesterday: the altered rock formation, the changed ravine, the unfamiliar vegetation zones, all of them were here, correctly represented. The map on these walls was not of the forest as it was 2 years ago, when I had last surveyed it. It was of the forest as it was now, as if the structure itself was a living survey instrument, as if something in it was perpetually updating its record of the territory above. I sat down on the floor of the structure and put my back against the wall and looked at the map surrounding me and felt the analytical framework begin to dissolve. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but the way ice dissolves in water slowly at the edges, losing its sharp definition. Because here's the thing about being a cartographer. Here's the thing I had been trained to believe, that had become so foundational I'd stopped thinking of it as a belief and started thinking of it as reality. The map is the territory's representation. The map translates the real into the legible. The map is the product. The territory is the source. What I was sitting inside was a map that predated my surveys. That was more accurate than my surveys. that had documented the territory in its changing state continuously, without a surveyor, without an instrument, without a human agency to record and represent, which meant that the map was not the product. The map was the entity. Something in this forest, something old enough to have been here before the trail was blazed. Before the national forest was designated, before any human surveyor walked this terrain, had been mapping it, had built this structure as a record of its mapping, had kept the record current, and it had led me here. The diverging trail, the altered landmarks, the path that appeared where no path should be, it had led me here. I was not lost. I had been brought. The terror of that thought moved through me like cold water, and then, in the silence of the structure, the green light moving slowly on the mapped walls, I heard it. The sound from the night before, the sound like paper being folded and unfolded, coming from directly above me. I looked up in the convergence of the walls at the structure's apex, in the highest point of the interior space. Where the green light gathered and pooled, something moved. I will not invent details I didn't see clearly. What I saw was movement, deliberate, fluid, the quality of intelligence, the kind of movement that comes from something making choices rather than following reflexes. The shape of it was indistinct in the gathered light. The way a figure is indistinct seen through frosted glass, it was not threatening in its posture, not coiled, not reaching. It was attending. The way someone attends to something they have been watching for a long time and are now able to confirm. I did not move. I sat against the wall of the structure with my field notebook in my lap and my camera at my side, and I looked up at the thing at the apex of the walls, and it looked back. That is the only word for it. It looked back. The quality of its attention was extraordinary. I have been looked at by many things in many contexts. I know the difference between the automatic tracking of a stimulus and the engagement of an attending mind. This was the latter. It was seeing me specifically, taking in something particular about my presence. "Lo," I said. It came out entirely calm, which surprised me. The movement at the apex shifted. The folding and enfolding sound intensified briefly and then settled. And then something happened that I am going to describe as plainly as I can, because the plainness of it is the only thing that preserves its truth. The contour lines on the walls moved, not catastrophically, not in a way that rewrote the map entirely. They shifted subtly, a series of small adjustments rippling outward from the point directly above me. The place in the map that represented my current location. The lines reconfigured around that point. And the result of the reconfiguration was a feature I hadn't seen on the map before. A new element. Directly at the position I was sitting, a human figure. Very small, very precisely placed. A human figure sitting cross-legged on the map exactly where I was sitting on the floor. It had added me to the map. I stared at that for a long time, the thing above me, the intelligence in the structure. In the forest, in the map itself, had been doing what I did. What I had spent 7 years doing. Observing the territory, recording its features, updating the record when things changed. And now it had updated the record to include me. I was data. It was a new feature in a landscape that had been mapped by something far older and more patient, and more thorough than I had ever been. The professional irony of it, the cartographer added to someone else's map, broke. Through the terror, and I laughed. A short, stunned, entirely real laugh. The kind that happens when something is simultaneously terrifying and absurd and true. The sound at the apex. The folding sound stopped, then resumed. At a different rhythm. Slower, more deliberate, I had the feeling. Irrational and complete, that whatever was up there was also laughing, or the closest thing it had to laughter. I picked up my field notebook and opened it to a fresh page. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Can you understand language?" Silence. Then the walls shifted again, not the contour lines this time. Below the lines, in the deeper stone, something else appeared. Not contour lines. A different mark. A simple mark. A circle with a line through its center. In cartographic notation. A surveyed point. A known location. the symbol for a place that has been precisely established, telling me, in the only language it knew, and I knew both, I am here. I am known. I am placed. I looked at it for a long time. Then I wrote in my field notebook, the intelligence of this place communicates in geographic notation. It maps itself. It maps the things that enter its territory. It responds to being observed with observation. I underlined the last sentence. Then I added, it is not hostile. It is curious, the same thing I am. In the field, always something settled in me as I wrote that. The cold fear that had been living in my sternum since yesterday morning lost its edge. Not because the situation was less strange. It wasn't. It was utterly impossibly strange. But strange things, in my experience, are not the same as dangerous things. And the quality of this intelligence, its methodology, its patience, its recording impulse, was not dangerous. It was, in the deepest sense, familiar. I stayed in the structure for 4 hours. I know this because I logged the time in my field notes, entry after entry, documenting what I was observing with the professional thoroughness I'd spent 7 years developing. The walls continued to respond to my presence, small shifts, small additions. The human figure on the map was joined by more detail, a pack shape beside it. A small mark that I recognized as the notation for a campfire. It was documenting what I was doing as I did it. At some point in the 3rd hour, I stopped taking notes and just sat with it. Looked at the map on the walls, the detailed, accurate, continuously updated topographic representation of the forest surrounding me, and let myself understand what I was looking at. A mind that had been attending to this territory since before any human record of it. A mind that thought in the language of terrain, in elevation, in drainage, in vegetation, boundary, and geological feature. A mind that understood the land the way I wished I'd understood it, not as data to be extracted and recorded and filed, but as a living system to be known, continuously known. The knowledge never finished, never filed away, always current. I had been burning out these past years because my relationship with landscape had become transactional. I arrived, I measured, I left. The place never changed in my working life. It only produced data. I had been doing to landscape what certain kinds of loneliness do to people using them for what they produce, without attending to what they are. The intelligence in this structure had been attending to this landscape without extraction for longer than I could calculate. Without a deliverable, without a report, just knowing, the ongoing work of knowing a place, as it changed and grew and shifted over time, that was what the map on these walls represented. Not a product, a relationship. The kind of relationship I had lost somewhere in the years of field. Verification contracts and GPS units and USGS revisions. I looked up at the apex. The movement there had slowed to something barely perceptible, a slight oscillation, presence maintaining itself, attending. I think I understand what you've been doing here, I said. The habit of speaking aloud in the field, narrating observations into a recorder made. Talking to this thing feel less absurd than it might have, and I think I've been doing a bad version of it. A version without the care. The folding sound, slow and considered. I'm going to need to find my way back, I said. I need to leave. The walls shifted. The contour lines reconfigured in a section of the map I hadn't paid attention to, the northeast corner. The direction of the western access road, they clarified. A route appeared, not drawn, not added, but revealed. As if the map had always contained it and was now choosing to make it legible. A path out. My path out? I stood up. I looked at the route on the wall for long enough to commit its key features to memory, 2 creek crossings. A ridge, a descent into the access road drainage. I sketched it quickly into my field notebook. I turned toward the threshold. Then I stopped, without entirely knowing why. I did something I had never done in 7 years of field work. I took out a pencil and added something to my field sketch. Something that wasn't terrain data. A small drawing, rough, approximate of the structure. Of the map on its walls. of the human figure the intelligence had placed on its record. I was adding this place to my map. The responding sound from above was immediate. A rising oscillation, held for a moment, then gone. I crossed the threshold. I followed the route the walls had shown me. I found my way out. The path out was not the path in. I want to be clear about that because it matters for understanding what happened. The unknown trail I'd followed to the clearing was gone, or rather, when I turned back toward where it had been. I found the maintained Kettlebrook Trail blazed and clear, running exactly where my map said it should. The forest had put itself back in order. Or rather, and I believe this is closer to accurate, the forest had shown me what it needed to show me. It was now permitting me to use its ordinary face. I walked the last 2 miles to the western access road without incident. The landmarks matched the map. The trail was exactly as documented. The late afternoon light came. Through the hardwood canopy in long September, Angles in the forest was warm and bird-voiced and entirely normal. I got to my car at the eastern trailhead by looping the road, a 3-mile road walk that I barely noticed. Because I was deep inside my own head trying to process, I sat in the parking area for an hour before I drove. I had my field notebook on my lap, and I was looking at the sketch I'd made, the structure, the walls, the human figure on the map, the route the intelligence had shown me, trying to find the framework that could hold all of it. I couldn't find one. And that was when I understood something I'd been resisting for years. The absence of a framework is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be inhabited. My entire professional life had been organized around the principle that the territory could be made legible, that the right tools and training and methodology could translate any landscape into a map that would hold it. I had believed implicitly and completely that the map was adequate to the territory given, sufficient precision. What I'd sat inside for 4 hours was evidence that the territory always exceeds the map, that the best map is not the one that most comprehensively represents the terrain, but the one that is most honestly aware of its own incompleteness, that the relationship between the observer and the landscape is not one of capture, but of ongoing, it's humble attention. I had been capturing landscapes for 7 years. I had not been attending to any of them. I drove home. I called Theo when I had signal and told him I was out and fine. He said there'd been a message from my company, a field verification contract, a good one, multi-week, good pay. I told him I'd call them in the morning. I didn't call them in the morning. 7 months have passed since September. I want to tell you what's different, because the story isn't complete without it. I didn't take the field verification contract. I didn't take the 3 that followed it. I spent October and November doing something I hadn't done since graduate school. I mapped for myself, not for a deliverable, not for a client. I went back into the Ozarks, not to Kettlebrook, not yet, and I walked terrain that I'd surveyed before, and I made maps that weren't for anyone. They were only for the practice of attending. Maps that documented what I noticed, not what I was looking for. They were the best maps I'd ever made. In December, I enrolled in an environmental cartography program at a university in Fayetteville, a hybrid, academic and field-based course designed for people who want to integrate traditional survey practice with ecological knowledge. The professor, a woman named Dr. Hargrove, who had spent 20 years studying indigenous mapping traditions, looked at my professional portfolio on the first day and said, "You're technically excellent." She paused. "What do you love?" I told her about the structure, about the map on the walls, about the human figure added in real time. She was quiet for a long moment. "That's called relational cartography," she said finally. "The idea that a map is not a static representation, but an ongoing dialogue between the observer and the terrain. That the map changes because the territory changes, and the territory changes because it's observed." She was looking at me steadily. "Where did you encounter this concept?" "In the field," I said. She nodded slowly. "The field is a good teacher. I am in the program now. I am making different maps than the ones I used to make. Not less precise, but differently intentioned. Maps that acknowledge the observer. Maps that leave room for the features that don't fit the current framework, that flag them as data rather than errors. Maps that are honest about their INCO implemences. I have been back to the Kettlebrook Trail once. In late February, when the forest was bare and the light came down clear and unfiltered through the empty canopy, I walked the full 10 miles, and the trail was exactly as mapped. Every landmark in its correct position, every blaze clear and accurate. At mile 8, I stopped, looked at the point where the unknown trail had diverged from the main path in September. There was nothing there now, just the maintained trail running northeast. Exactly as documented, I stood at that point for a while. I took out my field notebook and I wrote, "Feature present September, absent February, seasonal, intentional, document for follow-up data notation, not a conclusion." The honest acknowledgement that something is there that I don't yet understand, that is the best I can do. That is, I have come to believe the most anyone can do. To attend carefully, to record honestly, to resist the urge to flatten what is unresolved into what is comfortable, to leave room on the map for the things that exceed it. Old maps, the ones made before aerial survey. Before satellite imaging, before the full geographic inventory of the planet had blank spaces, not errors, not omissions through negligence. Honest blank spaces, marked with the notation terra incognita. Unknown territory. Modern maps have no blank spaces. We have covered the globe with data, resolved every coastline and ridgeline and drainage into coordinates, left no terra incognita anywhere on the surface of the earth. We are wrong to believe this. The blank spaces are still there. They are not geographic now. They are dimensional, temporal. The blank spaces on modern maps are the parts of the territory that exist in registers.
Our
instruments don't measure. The old forests and their long memories, the landscapes that have been known by non-human intelligences for longer than our maps have existed. The features that appear on certain days in certain light and are gone the next morning, leaving no trace the GPS will recognize. The trail led me back somewhere I'd never been, but somewhere on a map carved into stone and updated by something old and patient and attending. It had always been there, documented, precise, a feature of the territory. I was led in what I found there in the structure, the mapped walls, in the patient intelligence at the apex of the curved stone, was not a mystery solved. It was a mystery that handed me back my own curiosity, which is, I think, what the best maps have always done, not told us where we are, shown us how much more there is to find.